This week, most of our focus is on events linked to the 1960s, and that means in many ways to the Cold War and the Vietnam War, and to the counterculture and protest movements of the 60s. Backgrounds, by the way, are fabrics from the 1950s and 1960s. As we saw in Week 3, there was much about the 1950s that was familiar and traditional for Americans of those years, including the structure of families and the role of the sexes, but stresses were clearly forming. We also saw stresses in foreign policy, including the Suez Crisis, U-2 incident, Bay of Pigs incident, Berlin Wall, and Cuban Missile Crisis. There was, in other words, little easing of the Cold War during its second decade. Americans adjusted through building or planning to build fallout shelters and hoping to receive word of American successes in science, more than, for example, bubble wrap, TV dinners, Velcro, and credit cards. Most basically, of course, they wanted to avoid a nuclear World War III that would destroy much of humankind. Some adjustments were serious, some were critical of a post-war world that increasingly threatened the planet with annihilation. Increasing the stresses and tensions were protest movements that challenged most aspects of American life, a life that older Americans had sacrificed for and had built with a significant degree of pride. Some young people, for example those who formed Americans for a Democratic Society in the late 1950s, and those who defined themselves or were labeled as beatniks, challenged that America, as did those, as we have seen, whose dating behavior and musical taste seemed out of line with traditional mores and values. Demands for racial equality were hardly new to the post-1945 country, but they increased with great impact after the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, after the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955, and after the year-long Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56. Quickly following were sit-ins, freedom rides, and even presidential promises that we shall overcome. Federal legislation, most notably the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, joined the court decisions, presidential actions, and mass protest. Those accomplishments, as impressive as they were in their own right, were also models for deeper and wider change. If African Americans demanded their rights as citizens and human beings, so did women, Native Americans, Latinos, and gay men and women. With the revitalization of rock and roll and the so-called British invasion came the popularity of not just folk music, but of protest music. The music supported the movements and soon came to play a major role in the protests associated with the Vietnam War. As a battlefield within the Cold War, as was the Korean War only a little over a decade earlier, the Vietnam War of the 1960s to mid-1970s sparked widespread protest. Although most Americans supported U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia in order to stop the spread of communism there, and thus reduce the threat to the United States, those who opposed the war for one reason or another were vocal and learned how to garner media attention. Whether opposing the war because, for example, they questioned the legal basis, or because they did not see American security threatened, or because they opposed the draft, protesters reflected broader concerns about the country in the 1960s. Some protesters believed that the entire American system needed destruction and replacement. Others merely wanted the U.S. to withdraw from a particular war. Regardless, like the so-called juvenile delinquents in the 1950s, they were seen as threats to order and stability. It did not matter if they were elderly Quakers, civil rights leaders, Vietnam veterans, or women. All and more were anti-war protesters. All and more were seen by other Americans as unpatriotic and un-American. Many of the iconic images of the war suggest the negative view that not just the Vietnam War but all war was assuming for millions of Americans unhappy with their country less than 30 years after the good war of World War II. For many Americans, their country seemed to be coming apart. Vietnam played a central role, of course, but it did not play the only role, as our readings and films over the last 3 weeks and for Week 4 make clear. Now, for a few reminders. With the start of Week 4, we are less than 2 weeks from the end of the session, so please remember the second Writing Center requirement. As Week 5 brings the final exam project, the more thoughtful and thorough you are in your assignments and projects, the better prepared you will be. That is especially important as the summer session allows only one day between the last class day and the final. If you have not been posting responses, please begin doing so. Late is better than never. It will benefit your grade, but also your classmates and yourself in terms of thinking and focus. And don't forget to submit responses according to the new deadlines announced last week and on the website, and consider responding to the classmates' responses. Finally, note the new requirement indicated on the website to submit a list of the feedback you have received on your projects.